Each animal is part of a cycle older than industry itself. On, nurtured with care, prepared with purpose.
What once protected life will now become a craft, a drowning, the first touch of transformation.
The next destination awaits, a factory built on precision and tradition.
Keep it coming straight back. Watch the crates on the left. All right, stop right there.
The journey continues, a silent passage between nature and manufacture. Here at the facility, every animal is tracked electronically from the moment it arrives, ensuring total transparency.
Technology guides the process, reducing motion to mechanical rhythm. Here, material and biology converge Pulchgun, the moment when nature's surface becomes raw material.
From the fields to the factory pour-in, the cycle completes its first turn.
This scene depicts step 135 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 133 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 132 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 130 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 128 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 127 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 19 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 126 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 123 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 124 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 122 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 121 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 120 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 119 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 118 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 116 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 117 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 30 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 113 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 111 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 110 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 109 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 108 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 107 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 106 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 105 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 104 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 102 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 101 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 99 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 98 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 97 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 96 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 95 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 94 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 92 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 91 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 90 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 89 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 88 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 86 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 85 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 84 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 83 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 81 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 80 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 79 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 78 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 77 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 76 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 75 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 74 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 73 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 72 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 71 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 70 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 69 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 68 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 67 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 66 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 65 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 64 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 63 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 62 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 61 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 60 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 59 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 56 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 55 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 54 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 53 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 52 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 48 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 50 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 49 of the leather production process.
Watch the conveyor.
Clear. Move the stack to the drying rack now.
This scene depicts step 44 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 43 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 42 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 41 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 103 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 40 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 39 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 38 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 37 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 36 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 35 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 112 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 34 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 114 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 115 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 33 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 32 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 31 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 29 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 25 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 26 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 24 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 22 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 20 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 18 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 17 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 16 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 15 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 13 of the leather production process. This scene depicts step 11 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 10 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 9 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 8 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 6 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 7 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 5 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 4 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 3 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 2 of the leather production process.
This scene depicts step 1 of the leather production process.